Welcome to week 4. We start off this week with a wonderful slide full of the most amazing faces that you can see on earth. The babies. I love children. I used to be a preschool teacher, so I love working with the little ones. But look at these amazing and beautiful little faces. And you know there's some characters too, right? You can just tell. Look at those little smiles. But I asked the question, which child is the most deserving of a happy, healthy, and prosperous life? Let that marinate for a minute. Which one of these kids is most deserving? I would hope that in your mind you're saying that's a ridiculous question. How on earth would we ever be able to say, oh, this child over another is more deserving of a positive life and a positive future? And to me, that's a main um, concern and area of interest for the field of ethnic studies, which is that we all deserve to be successful and happy and healthy and prosperous. There is no human life that is more valuable than another. Every single one of these babies deserves an equitable chance at having a positive future. So I hope that we carry that sentiment in our hearts as we explore different histories of people that we share our world with. That the goal is to create a world where all of these beautiful little children have the same chances for a happy, healthy, and prosperous life. This week, you will learn about the origins of racism and how it created social, religious, political, and educational perspectives and systems that have negatively impacted human beings for more than 700 years. I was a person who used to really wonder about the origins of racism. My spirit was seeking to identify how did it really begin. Some of us think that it may have begun with slavery or colonialism, but it's really hard to pinpoint exactly the processes and who was responsible. So, as we begin, I ask that you ask yourself these questions. Have you ever wondered about the very beginnings of racism in our world? And if it's just some inherent human trait that is within people to be racist, was it always a part of human existence to look at others differently who looked different than you? Of how and where did racism begin, and who was responsible for the development of racist ideology and views and perspectives, and why? Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next few slides. Check out this quite ominous image of a gathering, a meeting, if you will. This took place in Spain somewhere in the 15th century. The limpieza de sangre, or the purity of blood doctrine, was created at meetings such as this. What was the limpieza de sangre? It was a doctrine that was created by Spain, the first nation to begin colonization in the quote unquote New World. At that time, in order to hold a position of power, in order to live or be a citizen or travel in the Spanish Empire, you needed a probanza, or a certification de limpieza de sangre, right? Limpieza, to clean, like clean blood, pure European Christian blood. When you see this picture, you see the characters who are wearing those tall, white, pointy hats. What does that remind you of? I know personally, I would say, ooh, that looks kind of like KKK, right? Which is another quote unquote organization that was founded on the basis of white purity, right? And we will make connections in upcoming weeks. But this is the very beginning of indoctrinated racism on earth. And we're going to watch a short video that further explains the details of the limpieza de sangre. Because I was unable to embed the short excerpt Limpieza de Sangre from the series Enslaved into this recording, I ask that you go to Canvas modules to watch the very short video. It is critically important that you view Limpieza de Sangre this week. What you see here is a picture that depicts the way that Spain interpreted the way that different people mixed with Spanish people. So you'll see Español con Moro. So black and Spanish equals a mulatto, or what makes you a mestiza or a chino. So it's very fascinating and also very concerning. But this is the direct linkage to the origins of racism as we know it on the earth today. So please watch the video Limpieza de Sangre. It enforced that individuals must be able to trace their lineage back 4 generations. That means 4 sets of grandparents had to have been white Europeans in order for you to be a resident or to have power or to travel within the Spanish Empire. This is what we are talking about when we say the beginnings of racism. So that was an excerpt from the series Enslaved, which is a super powerful series that I really recommend for you to check out. I think it's on Amazon Prime Video. But let's talk about this. The purity of blood for all 4 lines meant that, and of course, this was written in about 1722. All 4 of your grandparents had to have been Christian in order for you to be considered a pure human being underneath the Spanish doctrine. This excluded Jewish people, this excluded Muslim people from being able to obtain positions of power and to reside in the Spanish Empire. And it justified the acts of colonization, genocide, slavery, torture, murder, rape, etc. If your bloodline for 4 grandparents were not purely European, therefore you were considered a pagan, therefore anything negative that they wished to do to you was justified because you were not considered a pure human being. And it didn't even matter if they converted you to Christianity at that point, because even though you were a convert, your 4 grandparent lines were not Christian, so you would never be considered equal. And this is the true origin of racist ideology. Please read along with me for the next couple of slides because there is so much critical information. I'm going to need to share it with you word for word. The European origins of racism. Beginning in the late 14th century, a very close relationship was forged between the racial ideologies of raza in Spain and casta in Portugal. Raza was a racial ideology that differentiated between people based on the heresy in their lineage. It held that the heresy of Jews and Muslims was inherited by blood in humans, just as various characteristics were inherited by blood in animals. And heresy means opposing doctrine to Christianity, opposing beliefs or different beliefs other than a different religion. The Portuguese sistema de casta was a racial ideology that differentiated between people based on skin pigmentation inherited through blood. Casta developed in opposition to the indigenous peoples in the quote unquote New World, who populated the soon to be discovered colonies of Spain and Portugal. So we have to understand these 2 concepts of raza and casta. Blood lineage and skin pigmentation, which, when combined, really were the foundations of racist ideology in Spain and Portugal. By 1702, casta became entirely associated with color. By the time this discussion took place in 1702, few institutions, religious or otherwise, questioned the association of black blood with impurity, and black skin color had become a marker of impure ancestry. In the course of the 17th century, the concept had gone from being mainly associated with having old Christian ancestry to being connected to whiteness. This link would become even stronger in the 18th century with the introduction of the Spanish into the quote unquote New World. It is estimated that up to 95% of the original indigenous population was destroyed. There is no question that the Spaniards destroyed large numbers of people through violence, but many have said that the largest percentage of the indigenous population was destroyed by diseases carried over by the Europeans, such as typhus, smallpox, measles, etc., that they had never encountered and to which they had no resistance. In any case, it is clear, as there was no census, it can never be established exactly how many people died, nor whether it was due to Christianizing genocide or disease. As the indigenous population had been reduced so drastically, 80 to 95% reduced, Spain imported the African or black slaves initially under the control of Portugal to introduce a new labor supply and to withstand disease as well as be profitable business. Initially, black slaves were introduced by Hernan Cortez to work on the very first sugar plantations after the populations of indigenous Indians had been reduced so drastically due to disease, murder, and torture and genocide. So, this is showing us the very ways that racism transferred initially from religion and blood lineage to skin color, and the ways that the Spaniards and the Portuguese decimated indigenous populations when they traveled to the New World and needed desperately, in order to achieve their goals, a labor supply, which could no longer be filled by the indigenous native people of the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, they needed another labor supply, and Africans were the next in line. So I know that some of us question, why would Spain and Portugal resort to such cruelty, what some may consider evil tactics, in order to gain progress and success for their countries? And in order to ponder that question, we have to consider the factors that led Europe to commit these centuries of colonization, genocide, racism, and white supremacy. Let's explore the conditions of Europe in the 1400s and 1500s on the eve of the emergence of the slave trade, of the processes of centuries of colonization. So, these pictures paint a pretty dreary image of what life was like in Europe. There were widespread um, examples of famine, starvation, a lack of food, a lack of resources, uh, bad weather, which prohibited the growth of healthy crops, of fruits and vegetables, or limited ability to grow healthy food and vegetables, which would maintain nutrition for healthy people. So starvation impacted Europe. Infant and childhood death The rates of infant and childhood death were rampant because children were unnourished, exposed to diseases, living in filthy conditions. So population was not able to flourish and grow. Violence and brutality was apparent. And as you can see in some of these images, the lifestyles, you see beheadings, you see people fighting each other and wars. Um, you can see up at the top the image of people fighting over a dog, probably to eat because of lack of food. So violence and brutality plagued European countries. Disease, obviously, which rampaged communities. And you can see in one of the pictures a scary looking person on a deathbed looking like he or she's being visited by like the angel of death. Very scary. Up at the top, the procession of the skeletons with scepters, very dark and depressing and scary. Overcrowding conditions. There is a very limited amount of land in Europe for people to spread out. So when people are forced to live in close confines with disease and starvation added into the picture, it led to a very bad outcome. Poor weather, as I had mentioned, cold, dark, dampness with little sunshine, um, early death or people dying too early of diseases, and lack of resources for people to grow and flourish. So, this is just but a very quick snapshot of the conditions that human beings in Europe were living through in this time frame, which led to the deep desire to expand outside of Europe. And you can imagine when these individuals traveled outside and saw the beauty, the lushness, the richness of the land of the Caribbean, of the Americas, of Africa, and all of the resources that these lands had. You can almost imagine why they were so tempted and became so obsessed with leaving their diseased and cold and forbidden homelands for other places. Let's also look at the natural resources on the European map. So, what do we see predominantly here? We see coal, copper, fish, iron ore, lead, petroleum, silver, timber, uranium, zinc. What do these things have in common though? They're mostly metals, right? Precious metals. We don't see gold, maybe a little bit of silver, yeah, maybe copper, but not gold, and definitely coal. And if we're looking at Spain and Portugal, we see coal predominantly, maybe lead, um, and throughout Europe as well, uh, metals. And that played a critical role in the development of their warfare and their ability to go into uncharted territories and destroy civilizations. And we will make the link between the natural resources of Europe versus the natural resources of the lands of the Americas and Africa in a moment. Now let's look at a map of Africa as a contrast to the map of Europe's natural resources. And what do we see? What do we notice is different? I think one of the main things that we can identify is how rich African land is with precious resources such as gold and diamonds and oil and gas. Um, in comparison with Europe, who traditionally had mostly hard metals, right? So we see in Africa the presence of oil, gas, coal, copper, bauxite, gold, diamonds, timber, uranium, chromium. And when we look at the West African territories from which most of the African ancestors descended from, we see that those lands of Ghana, Cameroon, Gabon, Sierra Leone had diamonds, had gold, had timber, had bauxite and copper as well. Africa is a rich continent with resources beyond just these precious metals, but also the fertility of the land to be able to support the growth of fruits and vegetables and resources that human beings need in order to be healthy, in order to live. So it's really critical that we identify at the very beginnings of colonization and of the slave trade what these lands had that made them so appealing for Europeans, particularly Spain and Portugal at the onset, to pillage, to rob, and to covet for themselves, for the wealth of their own nations. When we move to an exploration of the natural resources of the lands of the Americas and the Caribbean, we see a similar resource as in Africa, meaning the richness of the land in gold and copper and different resources such as natural gas, petroleum, silver, lead, aluminum, coal, etc. These lands, similar to Africa, were also overwhelmingly rich with resources in contrast to Europe's resources, which again leads us to better understand why Spain and Portugal were so desperate to plunder these territories and expand their empires into these more desirable lands for their people. Here's a snapshot of the populations of the Americas prior to European colonization and exploration. I certainly don't have time to name each various tribe, but what's important to note is that every bit of land of the United States, of Canada, of Mexico, of Central America was occupied, was civilized by a native or indigenous people that were vastly decimated at the arrival of the Spanish and of the Portuguese. And to this day, although we don't know often the names of the lands that we live on, the indigenous names of the lands and the people that occupied the land that we live on, we must acknowledge that this land was robbed and stolen from them, and that their people were killed, murdered by various means in the name of colonization. So we always give respect to the indigenous peoples and lands that we occupy today. Another image of the United States in 1492 and the beauty of the people whose land this is. And this slide portrays the reality of the genocide committed against Native American peoples from 1784 to 1972. If we look at the top left corner, we'll see 1784 to 1819, how densely populated America was by Native American tribes. And as you can see, as the years go by, little by little by little by little, until we come to our present day Indian reservations, you can see how the people and their lands have been taken over, and how they have been reduced incredibly in size and in number to a few present day Indian reservations. And this is a harrowing reality of the sheer numbers of Native people who were either killed or who were forced off of their land by colonization to get to where we are today, where we see so few Native American reservations and people in our societies. And this is absolute genocide, and this is absolute evil. Europe's most dangerous technology, armor and swords. Please read along with me. The conquest of the Americas proves decisively the advantage of advanced armor and weaponry in any conflict. The Aztecs and the Incas numbered in the millions, yet were defeated by Spanish forces numbering in the hundreds. How is that possible? Many of us have seen the images of the battles between the Aztecs and the Spaniards and wondered, why is there such a disadvantage when we see Aztecs fighting in their bare skin with maybe spears or other weapons that they had fashioned versus Europeans heavily coated in armor from head to toe. Let's keep reading. Like the cavalry, Spanish foot soldiers made good use of swords. A heavily armored Spanish foot soldier could cut down dozens of indigenous people in minutes with a fine Toledan blade. A heavily armored conquistador could slay dozens of foes in a single engagement without receiving one serious wound. Encased from head to toe in a steel shell, Spanish conquistadors were all but invulnerable when facing native opponents. Horses were another advantage that the natives could not counter. So, if you've ever asked yourself, how is it that Spain and Portugal were able to come into civilizations with millions of people who were trained in war, who were warriors, who could fight? How is it that they were able to conquer and colonize these people? It's very simple. They had the advantage of armor and swords. And how did they have those things? Because their resources in their countries provided for them to be able to create those armors that would allow them to slay, as this slide depicts, dozens of people in minutes. And maybe this might help us create a more clear understanding of the disadvantage that native and indigenous people had when fighting the Spaniards and the Portuguese. And it was no lack of strength or no lack of intelligence on behalf of native people. It was just simply that they did not have the armor in battle, and they didn't have the horses, which provided the Europeans with a great advantage in their colonization and in their genocide. Another example of an advantage that Europeans had over Africans and peoples of the Americas is guns and gunpowder. Like modern computer manufacturers, the gunsmiths of late medieval and early modern Europe were growing more effective at making weapons. And as in modern industries where productivity growth was particularly rapid when new weapons were first introduced. When the first handguns appeared on the scene circa 1400, and at that point they were very tiny little handheld cannons that were fired from on top of the city's walls. The metal founders who cast them reduced the prices drastically. Gunpowder reached Europe from China shortly before 1300, and firearms appeared during the 14th century. And the earliest surviving firearm in Europe had been found in Estonia, and it dates back to around 1396. But by 1380, handguns were known across Europe. This picture does a pretty good job of summing up what the processes of colonization and the robbing, pillaging, and plundering of Africa and the Americas looks like. As you can see, we now have an image of the continent of Africa that is just kind of dug out while all of its riches are now sitting on top of the lands of Europe. And when we look on the opposite side and see South America, Mexico, Central America, etc., we see how those lands have been robbed with the gold and all of the profits and wealth now sitting in the North Americas as well. Read along with me, please. By 1600, Spain had reaped substantial monetary benefits from New World resources. Gold and silver began to connect European nations through trade, and the Spanish money supply ballooned, which signified the beginning of the economic system known as capitalism. The new riches ultimately created mass inflation and economic distress. However, Spain gained creative capital from their new global reach. These developments catapulted Spain into the Golden Age, or Siglo de Oro. Riches poured in from the colonies, and new ideas poured in from other countries and new lands. The Habsburg dynasty, who ruled over the territories of Austria, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Spain, encouraged and financed a blossoming Spanish Renaissance culture, both in the colonies and in Spain. So, as the peoples of the territories that were colonized suffered, the benefactors of colonization flourished. And we can see those examples of wealth still present in Europe and in North America today. And now we can see how what is now considered the third world has been left as a result of such systems and such policies of capitalism. Here we can see a few disturbing political images or propaganda that was used during the European colonization efforts of Africa, particularly the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, in which you see a group of European men, potentially French, um, with a cake, if you will, that says Afrique or Africa, and that they can just slice up and everybody takes a slice as if Africa is just theirs for the taking. And on the right hand side, you see a picture of a man with his grubby fingers kind of grabbing all over Africa for its gold. So you can understand the notion that these lands were just ripe for the taking. And it didn't matter that they, were ancient lands with ancient civilizations that belonged to people. Africa was now seen as land and people ripe for the taking. This image always troubles me when I see it, but the image of a European man standing with his feet and arms outstretched across the entire continent of Africa as if it is his, as if he owns it, right? When we look at the map, we can see African colonization after the Berlin Conference, which we will read about more in depth. But basically, this is how the countries were divvied up among different European countries. So you can see the heavy prominence of French colonialism throughout West Africa into Central Africa, British in red, uh, uh, Portuguese in yellow, German in orange, Italian in blue, Spanish also, right? So Africa was a cake or a pie to them that they could conquer and take over. And to this day, these nations were colonized, with the exception of two African countries, which were able to avoid colonization or gain their liberation. are identified by the only two nations in Africa which are labeled as free, one being Liberia on the west coast of Africa, and the other being Ethiopia on the east coast, who was able to fight off the Italian invasion and protect Ethiopian land from colonization. But every other nation, as you can see, was colonized and divided up by European nations. And on this slide, we see the impact of European colonization of the Americas and how the different countries of Europe divvied up American territories. On one side, we can see the British Empire in pink, the Danish, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, etc. And you can see the lands which were claimed by these respective countries. And that gives us an understanding of why today Brazil speaks Portuguese, because they were colonized by Portugal, right? Why Jamaica speaks English? Well, they were colonized by the British. The areas in the Caribbean that are French speaking, that were colonized by France. I mean, Haiti, for example. And of course, the territories that were colonized by Spain, which are Spanish speaking countries to this day. But again, this is an example of how Europe cut up and divided up the lands amongst European countries, depending upon which country and which territory they were interested in. I would now encourage you to take a peaceful moment of reflection, a little break, to let everything that we just discussed sink in before we move forward. We've covered a lot of heavy topics, but by now you should be putting the pieces together of the origins of racism, the conditions which led to it, the people who were involved and their reasons and justifications, the impacts of the early processes of colonization. And we've barely begun to scratch the surface because we haven't gotten into the processes yet of slavery. But take a moment to think about it, put the pieces together, and maybe take a break. And then when you can return, we'll move on to the critical vocabulary. The first definition this week is perhaps one of the most important concepts that we will ever explore in this course, which is the definition of race. Now, many of us think of the term of race and say, I know what race means. It's who you are. Are you Black? Are you African American? Are you African? Are you Asian? Are you Native American? Are you Latino? Are you Indian? Yeah, those are races, right? But it is much more complex than that. Please read along with me. Race refers to the categories into which society places individuals on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color, hair type, facial form, etc. Though many believe that race is determined by biology, it is now widely accepted that this classification system was in fact created for social and political reasons. I'll repeat this. Race is not determined by biology. It is inaccurate. There is only one race, which is the human race. And certainly there are variations of ethnicity within the human race. But we are only one race. This classification system was developed to put white Europeans at the top and people with darker skin at the bottom of social stratification. So there is no accuracy genetically or biologically to the concept of race. It is a system that places some at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. And it is a system that has justified colonization, genocide, racism, slavery, etc. for centuries. If we look at the bottom paragraph, it says there's actually more genetic and biological differences within a quote unquote racial group than among quote unquote different races. So I implore you to reprogram your mind at this point. Begin the processes of deprogramming what has been instituted and indoctrinated into us as human beings, that we are different races. We are only one race. We are the human race. And certainly we have different ethnicities. But I would encourage you to even stop using the categories of race if possible. If you look at this picture, you can see how the early eugenicists, or people who promoted that Europeans were the one true pure race, would use things such as the human skulls to dictate a stratification of who was more intelligent or who was more civilized. And it's a fascinating history to explore, the history of eugenics and the development of the concepts of race. But while racism is a false construct, racism is certainly real. So that presents a very complex reality that we have to grapple with, and we will explore much more about that in the future. Let's define racialization, or the processes through which people began to be designated as one particular race over another. As you can see in this picture, you see the principal varieties of mankind, right? In which, who's front and center? The white European male, which is deemed as the ideal standard for the different races. And then you see all of the different quote unquote racial varieties that are circulating around him. Again, we are going back to the understanding that race is not a biological, accurately correct concept. It was created. And therefore, the dividing of men and women on the earth into categories of race was a process that was carried out by European men for their own advantage. So, racialization is the process through which different groups were designated whatever quote unquote race Europeans decided they were. It is the process of manufacturing and utilizing the notion of race in any capacity, through which groups come to be socially constructed as races based on ethnicity, language, economics, religion, culture, politics, etc. Here's another example of an image depicting the types of the races of man. And who's at the top? Of course, the Caucasian white men, or people who have lighter skin, are placed at the top. And then who are the people at the bottom? People of Africa, of Australia, of Native America, people with dark skin at the bottom. And people in the middle, probably, of Middle Eastern or Arab or Malaysia, as they claim in this image. This is more proof that racialization was a process that took place in order to stratify the different variations of mankind and to justify who should be at the top and who should be at the bottom. Now that we have a firm foundation of the understandings of the fallacy, the inaccuracy of race, and the development of racialization, we can expand into the definition of ethnocentrism, or if we break it down, the centering of one's ethnic group as the ideal standard. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to view others through the filters and assumptions of one's own group and practices, and to see one's own group as the norm, the best, or the ideal to which others should conform. So, living in the United States of America and in the world, as a matter of fact, to a larger extent, we see Eurocentrism as the norm, the ideal of beauty standards, of educational standards, of political standards, societal standards, which deem, European nations as first world countries, and nations that have predominantly people of color or of dark skin as quote unquote third world nations. Reading on in the second paragraph, belief in the superiority of one's own ethnic group may be a natural human tendency that advances the notion of dissimilarity between two ethnic groups. Each group tends to evaluate the other as to how similar or different the group is from its own. And the more similar people are, the greater they accept each other. The more dissimilar, the more negative stereotyping occurs, right? Which leads to hostilities and misunderstandings. Certainly, I think we can recognize as Americans the ethnocentrism of our own country, the centering of white European standards as the ideal standards, and others are marginalized. And you can see in this image, you see a white guy telling the black guy, go back to Africa, right? This is our country, whatever. Right? And then you see him talking to a Mexican guy, go back to Mexico. And then in the final little section, he's just kind of, stumped. Because what are you going to say to a Native American? You can't tell a Native American go back to their country because we are in Native American land and Native American territory, right? So, anyway, ethnocentrism is the belief that one particular ethnicity's culture, traditions, society, etc., is the ideal way to be. So, a prominent form of ethnocentrism is Eurocentrism, or the tendency to view others through the filters and assumptions of European, primarily Northern European perspectives, and to assume European practices and perspectives to be the best, the ideal, the norm. And you don't have to be of European ancestry to be Eurocentric. There are plenty of people of color who adhere to this notion. A Eurocentric view considers history according to European experiences and paradigms. For example, the assumption that the history of the United States began with the arrival of Europeans. And a lot of us, it's not our fault necessarily if we believe these things, because this is what we were taught to believe, and this is what we were taught in our schools. Yeah. So there's a process of deprogramming that has to take place in order to train our brains to not think this way and to begin to open our minds to accepting other ethnic and ethnicities, belief systems, ways of governing, ways of educating, ways of healing, on, as being important and as being as valuable as those of European culture. And as we can see in this picture, once again, we see, two Europeans slicing up the world for their own greed, to put on their own plates, right? Don't forget to add your vocabulary words to your critical vocabulary chart. Here are your Chapter 3 Establishing North American Slavery Essential Questions. Could the process of capturing, enslaving, torturing, murdering, raping, and kidnapping Africans, including babies, children, women, and elders, be carried out by sane individuals? By individuals who are in their right mind? Why or why not? Is there any rationale or reasoning which could ever justify the cruelty of slavery? Why or why not? Thank you for watching this very long week 4 video, but very important week 4 video. I hope that you are well. Remember, as always, we are stronger together. I will see you next week.